Hello, everybody. This is Chad Steplen from Rocky Mountain Institute. We're going to start the New Jersey Integrated Energy Plan webinar shortly, but for right now, we're just going to give folks a few more minutes to join and sort out any technology issues. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to take 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Just want to give folks a chance to join and sort out any technology issues. Thanks. Welcome, everybody, to the New Jersey Integrated Energy Plan public webinar, where we're going to share the results of our analysis and discuss the role and purpose and findings of the Integrated Energy Plan work. My name is Chad Steplen. I'm with Rocky Mountain Institute, and I would like to give the chance for the Board of Public Utilities to just welcome us to this webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Grace Power. On behalf of President Fiordaliso, I want to welcome you to this webinar today. As many of you know, I am serving as the chair of the 2019 New Jersey Energy Master Plan Committee. We began our work last May when the governor signed Executive Order 28. And since that time, we have held 15 public stakeholder meetings. We have published a draft energy master plan for comment in June. And as you know, we are utilizing this integrated energy plan that Rocky Mountain Institute is working on for us to inform the final plan that will be delivered at the end of this year. In terms of housekeeping, we are going to have these slides available on the Energy Master Plan website, and we are also going to make this webinar public on the Energy Master Plan website. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to RMI.
Thank you. So this is Chad Steplen with Rocky Mountain Institute, and I will be hosting the first part of this webinar. There's a lot of material to go through, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The agenda for today is to first introduce the intent of the Integrated Energy Plan, and then I will go through the high-level findings. At that point, it'll probably be about 25 to 30 minutes for that material, and then we'll provide an opportunity for question and answer. And then my colleague, Jeremy Hargreaves from Evolved Energy Research, will go further into the detailed findings, and then we'll have a final question and answer session. If you'd like to ask questions, you may do so using the questions feature from GoToWebinar. You have to use your computer or the app on your mobile device to ask those questions. So we hope the technology sorts itself through. We will do our best to answer all the clarifying questions we can about the integrated energy plan process, modeling assumptions or methodology, and of course the modeling results. These slides and the webinar itself, the plan is to share those with everybody publicly soon after the webinar. So getting started, the New Jersey Integrated Energy Plan is the purpose of this webinar today. The intent of the plan is to inform New Jersey's energy master plan by modeling least cost pathways that meet both the energy needs of New Jersey's growing economy and the state's emissions reduction targets. The modeling and interpretation has been informed by 2 workshops in June and October. So we shared these results with some stakeholders just a couple weeks ago. The Board of Public Utilities invited stakeholders to those workshops with the intent of representing New Jersey's diverse interests. To do the Integrated Energy Plan analysis, the Board of Public Utilities contracted with Rocky Mountain Institute. And my name is Chaz Teplin. I'm with RMI, and my colleague Mark Dyson is here and will probably help as well with the webinar today. RMI is an independent nonprofit organization with 35 years of experience in energy analysis. Our mission is to transform energy use to create a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. To do the analysis, we're working together with our partners, Evolved Energy Research. Evolved has deep industry knowledge and extensive consulting experience focused on the questions posed by the energy transformation. Evolved's mission is to provide decision makers the analytical tools and insights they need to manage energy system transformation. Jeremy Hargraves is on this webinar as well, and he will present the second half of slides after I've introduced our process and presented the high-level findings and done some Q&A. This is where we are in the project. We have completed modeling, and we are working to hear and incorporate feedback from the into the final IEP report and the Energy Master Plan. The purpose of the Integrated Energy Plan, broadly speaking, is to both understand where New Jersey's energy system is now, where is that energy system going, where would we like to be in 2050 in order to meet the emissions goals, and what are least cost pathways that allow us to get there. The project itself kicked off in March. We initially worked to set up the model with all of the important inputs relevant to New Jersey specifically. And we began deciding how we would do the analysis by defining certain areas, and we did that together with stakeholders at the first workshop. We worked hard to incorporate comments and feedback as we did the analysis over the summer and early fall. The analysis is now complete, and it's being presented here and was presented in a second workshop. We will be incorporating feedback as we take this analysis and complete the Integrated Energy Plan and help inform the Energy Master Plan. As noted in the bottom left, the EMP Committee is opening up a comment period to provide written feedback to the IEP on the IEP following this webinar. And you can see that you can email emp.comments@bpu.nj.gov. Okay, I'm going to start by going into what New Jersey's energy system looks like today so that it can give a little bit of context there about where we need to go. I'm going to start with this simple chart showing where New Jersey's emissions come from today. So you can see that there are a few big boxes on this chart. The y-axis is emissions in carbon dioxide equivalent in million metric tons of CO2. And then the different boxes indicate different sectors of New Jersey's economy. You can see that the largest single bucket of emissions comes from the transportation sector. This is the gasoline and diesel used to power New Jersey's vehicles. Electricity makes up 17 MMT. Electricity sector is critically important, and we'll spend a lot of time discussing it. But actually today, it makes up not the largest fraction of emissions, even though often it's what we think of first. Emissions in the electricity sector and the building sector primarily come from the combustion of natural gas. You can see the building sector is actually larger than electricity itself and composes about 26 MMT. All of this data comes from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Building emissions is independent from electricity and includes the natural gas that we burn in buildings primarily for heating. There are also emissions from industry, often, again, natural gas or other direct fuel use, and a number of other sectors of the economy, some of which are energy and some of which are independent of energy. And then there's the great news that New Jersey's forests actually sequester some CO2, and so this reduces the total emissions from the state today. I want to go into electricity because we'll spend a lot of time talking about the electricity sector. You can see that this is how New Jersey has generated electricity over the last 30 years or so. You can see that in the 90s and 2000s, there was some generation from coal, but the dominant sources of electricity generation were nuclear and fossil natural gas. The contributions from natural gas has increased some, and that's mostly handled the increasing load, whereas coal has decreased. Nuclear has remained relatively constant. There's of course a lot of excitement about the role that solar can play in New Jersey, but you can see today, solar contributes a relatively small amount of electricity to New Jersey's total production. Of course, note that New Jersey is part of the PJM network of states, and so New Jersey does import some electricity and export some electricity. Those imports and exports on the whole approximately balance out, and this graph just shows how New Jersey generates in state. This work is motivated by two policies. The first is the Global Warming Response Act passed by the New Jersey legislature, and the second is Governor Murphy's executive order setting emissions reduction targets, specifically 100% clean energy. The Global Warming Response Act sets an 80 by 50 goal. What this means is that by 2050, the state needs to reduce economy-wide emissions. So that's not just electricity sector, but economy-wide, as shown in the chart, to 80% below 2006 levels. So you can see that the red line on the chart shows the 80 by 50 limit of 26 MMT. Again, compared to vehicles or buildings, those sectors would exceed or encompass the entire emissions budget for 2050. So the point of this slide is to show you where emissions are today and how far the state has to go in order to meet those, in order to meet its emissions goals. Briefly, I would go back and forth between talking about the 80 by 50 goal. Again, that's an economy-wide emissions reduction, so it includes vehicles, buildings, industry, et cetera. And then the 100% clean energy goal set by Governor Murphy, which requires the state to meet its electricity needs in a carbon neutral way by 2050. So sometimes I'll be talking about electricity and sometimes I'll be talking about economy-wide, and I'll try and make that clear as we go through the presentation. The goal of the IEP, the Integrated Energy Plan modeling, is to reveal least cost pathways that meet these emissions targets and the energy needs of New Jersey's growing economy. I'd now like to transition to talking about how New Jersey hosts, how we're doing the modeling that shows these pathways. So this very simple slide shows the basic outlines of the modeling approach. We start by modeling New Jersey's growing energy economy, The economy includes the residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors, and all of the end uses inside those sectors. So for example, this includes how many vehicle miles are traveled, all the heating needs in our businesses and homes, et cetera, industrial needs. The model uses a stock rollover model to understand how that energy needs will change. So as the population grows and the economy grows, we assume that those energy needs will grow alongside. And so, or at least those energy services will grow alongside. And using a stock rollover model, what that means is it assumes a certain lifetime for most energy appliances and vehicles. So it assumes that when someone replaces their vehicle because it's at the end of its life, they'll replace it with some new technology. And that's one of the key assumptions that goes into the model. And we use all of those assumptions to build up year by year New Jersey's energy needs, and that's represented by the second set of boxes. Specifically, we look for what is the overall need for electricity, for liquid fuels, and for gas fuels in order to power New Jersey's economy. The model then calculates what the least cost set of investments that New Jersey can make year by year in order to meet those energy needs. And this includes things like investing in new electricity generation. It includes things like investing in transmission or storage technologies. It includes fuel supply purchases and conceivably even carbon sinks. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that go into this analysis, and we want to be really explicit about the kinds of assumptions we're making. And here I've overlaid some of those categories of assumptions. In the light blue box on the left, you can see that we make a lot of assumptions about how new technologies are adopted. For example, EVs replacing internal combustion engine vehicles, where EVs are electric vehicles. For example, heat pumps replacing gas furnaces. On the right side, when we talk about how we meet the investments that meet New Jersey's energy needs, we include key assumptions such as what are the costs of different energy resources? For example, what's the cost of solar? What's the cost of offshore wind? We included assumptions based on policies that New Jersey could or does have in place, such as to have a certain amount of offshore wind by a certain date. And then finally, in the red box, we constrain the choices that New Jersey can have by the emissions constraints. So specifically, 80% by 2050 emissions reductions and 100% clean energy. We group these assumptions together into scenarios. So we run the model 9 times using 9 different sets of assumptions. And the assumptions are basically the pieces of the model that are inputs inside the red and light blue boxes. So we modeled 7 scenarios that meet the emissions targets using different sets of assumptions. And we modeled 2 reference cases that include a different set of assumptions, but were not forced to meet the emissions constraints. And I want to show you exactly what those scenarios were in the next couple of slides. This slide shows the 9 scenarios that we looked at using the model. We came up with these scenarios with lots and lots of conversations, both with stakeholders and together with the BPU Governor's Office and DEP. And the intent is to create a set of assumptions that we test to explore the key questions relevant to New Jersey. I'm going to start by describing reference 1 and reference 2. These two scenarios were not required to meet the emissions reductions. So reference 1 basically was a fossil business as usual. It did not even include some of the existing policies that the state has already passed. And the intent of reference 1 is sort of to understand what is the cost to supply New Jersey's economy with energy today using a business as usual system. Because of course, today New Jersey spends and invests a lot of resources, a lot of money onto its energy system. This includes things from the vehicles we buy, the power plants we build, and of course the fossil fuels that we use to fuel our appliances and energy system. Reference 2 is similar, except that it does include existing carve-outs and efficiency policies. And the intent here is to understand how far we can get with those existing policies. The least cost scenario is sort of our baseline scenario that looks at what will be the cost to meet New Jersey's goals with a specific set of demand side. That's sort of how people replace their vehicles, building appliances, et cetera. And relatively few constraints on how the supply side emissions constraints can be met. And so this is sort of, if all options are open to New Jersey, what is the least cost path to meet those goals? We then Importantly, the least cost and all of the variations that I'm about to discuss, they of course cost money, but so does the business as usual scenario. And so when we talk about cost, we always need to compare the least cost and the variation, the cost of those scenarios, to what we would spend anyways on the reference case. So again, we spend money on energy today. We need to consider how much more would we have to spend to meet the emissions constraints, emissions goals. Generally, when we speak of cost, I just want to caution folks, these are not necessarily ratepayer impacts, right? Because when we consider cost, we consider the full cost of the energy system. This includes, and is dominated in fact, by capital investments, by investments in end use. This includes the replacing of your, when it's end of life, replacing your vehicle with a new vehicle. Like, what is the cost of that? And so it's not a direct line between the cost that we're going to present today and ratepayer impacts. Okay, so I've discussed the least cost scenario, and then I'm briefly going to describe the variations, and Jeremy's going to go into those later. Variation one is, what if the entire region goes along with New Jersey in order to, and also tries to decarbonize? Variation two is sort of the opposite. It's what if New Jersey goes, tries to meet its goals using only internal resources and has reduced regional cooperation. Specifically, this means New Jersey is not able to easily import renewable resources from out of state. Variation three explores what happens if we retain fuel use in buildings, so we do not electrify the building sector practically at all. Variation four explores what happens to the cost if renewables and storage continue their recent fast cost decline. We use industry standard assumptions, which historically have been much too conservative about the fast cost declines that have actually occurred in renewables and storage. Variation five limits New Jersey's options in the sense that it forces nuclear plants to retire at their licensing dates and prevents the state from investing in any new natural gas plants. And finally, variation six asks the question, how would New Jersey meet its goals if it kept using liquid and gas fuels in vehicles? And what would the effect, the cost be if it was still forced to, if it retained transportation fuel use instead of electrification, but still tried to meet its goals? I'm not going to go through this eye chart of a slide. This is further detail about the scenarios that we use. And each of these boxes sort of captures the assumptions that go into the model. We worked hard with stakeholders and with the BPU to refine the assumptions of all of these boxes. And when these slides are made public, you'll have have an opportunity to look at them in detail. Okay, I guess I need a drum roll. This is the modeling results. And I'm gonna start with the key findings. There's going to be another set of slides here that I'll go through, and then we'll provide another opportunity for questions, or an opportunity for questions. And at that point, then we're going to transition over to Jeremy, and he's going to go into more detailed findings. This slide summarizes the most important findings that we found from the analysis. First and most importantly, New Jersey can indeed meet its Global Warming Response Act and 100% clean energy goals using existing technologies. New Jersey absolutely can meet its goals and continue to grow its economy. The second key finding is that the costs to meet New Jersey's emissions target are small compared to the total energy system spending, and they're less than the clean air benefits that the state would see. The third point is that existing policies get New Jersey started, but they are not sufficient to meet the clean energy targets. So more policy is going to be needed for New Jersey to meet its ambition. Our fourth point is that a least cost energy system that does meet New Jersey's goals, it is substantially different in key ways from today's energy system that I described on earlier slides. So obviously there's going to be a lot of important changes to New Jersey's energy system, and we're going to describe some of those in the coming slides. Related to the first finding, again, New Jersey can meet its Global Warming Response Act and 100% clean energy goals using existing technologies. This chart shows emissions under the least cost scenario. This is our sort of base case scenario that does meet the emissions goals. It shows emissions coming down year by year after 2050 when it does meet the 80 by 50 target. The dashed lines at the top of the slide labeled reference 1 and reference 2, those are the emissions trajectories that New Jersey would take without further policies or with no clean energy policies at all. Remember that reference 1 assumes sort of a fossil business as usual. This does not even include existing clean energy policies. Emissions still come down due to improving technologies, but not by very much. So in reference 1, emissions only come down a small amount, and we don't come anywhere close to meeting emissions targets. Reference 2, which it does include existing policies, such as, for example, the deployment of new offshore wind, does have an impact on emissions. And you can see that emissions come down from a bit under 100 to about 75 or so MMT. Well, that's a good start. In the coming years, it doesn't get nearly far enough. And so the point is that we do need to have substantial amounts of new policy and new actions in order to meet the targets. Generally speaking, you can see that emissions come down because the state uses much less natural gas, a little bit less diesel, and it uses almost no gasoline by 2050 as vehicles and buildings are electrified. Electrification plays a key role, and so the electricity sector plays perhaps an outsized importance in the new energy system. So carbon neutral electricity grows and transitions substantially, looks much different to meet the 100% clean energy goals. If you remember in the early slides I showed you, solar currently makes up a fairly small amount of New Jersey's electricity generation. That would change dramatically. There would be a lot of new solar in New Jersey in order to meet the emissions targets. Together with that, the use of natural gas in the state would go down substantially for electricity generation. Offshore wind and wind outside of New Jersey, this is wind connected to the PJM system, would also increase substantially. The nuclear fleet, you can see, does stay online as it provides a low carbon source of energy. The model finds that it's worth keeping the nuclear fleet going through 2050. I want to just note the clean firm section of the green wedge at the end. The intent of that is to show that New Jersey does need dispatchable electricity out through 2050. And this is to handle times when it's neither windy nor sunny. I'll talk a lot more about the clean firm in some of the future slides. Everybody understandably is interested in costs. So this slide is intended to show how much it will cost New Jersey to meet its emissions goals. The top line is that the cost of New Jersey to meet its emissions targets are small compared to total energy system spending and are offset by the benefits of cleaner air. The two bars in this chart show the cost of the total energy system on average as a percentage of GDP from 2020 to 2050. The actual numbers underlying this are shown at the bottom. Currently, New Jersey spends a little over, well, in the reference case, New Jersey spends about 3.5% of its GDP on the energy system. And I want to emphasize that these are not ratepayer costs, so a separate study would need to be done to understand exact insight on electricity bills. But this includes everything from money spent on vehicles and appliances in homes to the fuels that go into those appliances, and et cetera. So, and all the capital costs that go into generating electricity. So again, we're showing sort of the energy system spending as a percentage of GDP. So in the reference case, it's about 3.5%, and then it's only a small amount more to meet the emissions goals. Of course, that money goes to very different things. So costs would increase from 3.5 to 3.7% on average in order to meet the emissions targets. I want to break that down a little bit further in this chart here. So on the right-hand chart, we break that down a little bit further. The orange bar on the far left shows the incremental system costs. Again, these aren't ratepayer impacts. These are the additional spending that would be needed to purchase new equipment, purchase new generation capacity. So the state would spend more money on these kinds of capital improvements. Of course, there's a lot of costs in the existing energy system that are no longer incurred. Predominantly, these are fossil fuel purchases. If you buy an electric vehicle, that is supplied by predominantly, in our case, solar, wind. So we need to buy the EV, we need to buy the capital equipment, the wind turbines and the solar panels. But we no longer have to purchase gasoline to power our vehicles. And so all of those fossil fuel, or at least most of those fossil fuel costs, are now avoided. And that's shown by the red bar. So yeah, there's a little bit more than 15 billion or so of new costs or incremental costs, but then there's most of that is offset by reduced spending on fossil fuels. To put those costs in context, we show estimates for clean air health benefits from the American Lung Association for New Jersey, and then the social cost of carbon, which has a range, which is shown by the dark blue and the light blue boxes. So those $42 to $69 a ton for the social cost of carbon come from the EPA. Overall, this finds that there's a net benefit to New Jersey, so not a cost, but a net benefit to New Jersey in the range of $4 to $6 billion a year. This chart specifically is for the year 2050, and the costs do change year to year, and Jeremy will share some of that later. The next point is sort of to go a little bit further into how far we get with existing policies. So again, this chart shows the economy-wide emissions by fuel source for the reference case, in the reference 2 case specifically, which looks at what happens if existing policies are continued, but we're not required to meet the 80 by 50 or 100% clean energy goals. In this case, you can see that emissions do come down, as I mentioned before, but not nearly as fast as in the least cost scenario. And New Jersey does not meet its target. So the point, again, is that while the electricity sector comes down, there's some efficiency benefits that bring some fuel uses down. It's not adequate, and further action is absolutely needed for New Jersey to meet its 2050 goals. This slide starts to talk further about how New Jersey's energy system will change, specifically electrification of both buildings and the transportation sector. The reason electrification is beneficial is for 2 reasons. One is you can substitute carbon dioxide emitting fuels with electricity that can come from clean energy. And second, that electrification is almost always the ultimate efficiency measure. So this chart shows final energy demand, which means sort of the total energy required at end use. So this is the energy demand to make your car go or to make your furnace heat your home. The electricity use, because of electrification, increases substantially, and that's the blue bar at the bottom. However, the total energy required goes down because using electricity is more efficient than using gasoline or pipeline gas. This is typically natural gas that's used in furnaces or your vehicle. And so total energy demand goes down while electricity use does go up. Overall, this reduces costs. However, it does change our electricity system substantially. For those that follow the electricity sector, it's commonly understood that electricity peaks in places like New Jersey in the summer, when electricity is used a lot for air conditioning and cooling in buildings. And that's shown in the 2020 line at the bottom of the right-hand chart. You can see the monthly demand for electricity by month. However, that changes as we start to electrify, and so the electricity system becomes much different. And you can see that New Jersey would become winter peaking in the least cost scenario, and it would use overall dramatically more electricity. Again, this electricity demand is offset by the need to purchase gasoline and natural gas for end uses, and is not easily transferable or translatable into rates that you would see on utility bill. Okay, last, before I pause for questions, I want to go into a bit further about the natural gas used for electricity generation, and that's shown on this slide here. The left chart shows the electricity contribution from gas-fired dispatchable electricity generation. There's two things I want to note here. The first is that the fossil gas, the natural gas used for electricity generation, increases continuously throughout through to 2050. And then at the end, we need to continue to have some kind of dispatchable electricity generation. So the gas-fired electricity generation does not go to zero in 2050. And this is because we need some kind of clean, firm, dispatchable energy source that can make up for the times when there is very little wind or sun for multiple days. It's very expensive using existing technologies to use energy storage for that. However, what this clean, firm source of electricity will be, I would say is uncertain. There's a number of technologies that could play that role. There are some long duration storage technologies that are being tested now. We could continue to use the gas turbines that we already have, but we could fuel them using either biogas or a synthetic gas made using renewable sources. And of course, there is hydrogen power generation that's been considered for this end use. So the least cost scenario, of course, uses specific costs for all of these technologies. But those costs are relatively uncertain because they are mostly deployed toward the end of the analysis, when of course the uncertainties are higher. But given the inputs that we do use, the model selects biofuels powering gas turbines, biogas powering gas turbines with a little bit of hydrogen mixed in. And so that clean firm is what is captured by the model. The graph on the right shows the capacity of electricity generation sources that would be needed after 2050. And so you can see that a lot more solar, a lot of offshore wind, and a lot of storage would need to be deployed in New Jersey. Additionally, in red is the firm capacity, the clean firm capacity that is needed for reliability. Today, that's natural gas, and we actually need more of that capacity out in 2050. So again, the model chooses biogas-powered turbines, gas turbines for that out to 2050. We would actually need more of that capacity generation, but we don't need to make that choice until about 2035 because the need for new capacity doesn't occur for some time. And so one of the suggestions that we are likely to make is that New Jersey should continue to monitor what technology options look like they're going to be the most scalable and the most least cost in order to retain the reliability needed in 2050. Okay, with that, I'm going to pause and take questions.
Hi, so we have a fair amount of questions. I'm going to read them aloud and either Chaz or Jeremy will answer them. Our first question is, what time frame did you use to assess the warming impact of greenhouse gases?
We do take into account the enhanced warming potential of things like methane and other non-CO2 gases. I hope that's the right thing for that question. And we do take into account an estimate for upstream leakage of methane from natural gas. And there are some assumptions embedded in the model that New Jersey will use best practices for other highly warming gases. But the greenhouse gas potential of different gases is taken into account.
Okay, next question. What were the assumptions for energy efficiency increases? Were they applied economy-wide or only to specific sectors like housing?
Energy efficiency, we in the least cost scenario assume that energy efficiency programs continued and were quite aggressive. As I noted in the discussion on the slide about electrification, it's in this slide here. Electrification is sort of the ultimate efficiency measure because electric heating and electric transportation is much more efficient than burning fuels at the end use for those same purposes. So you can see the effect of efficiency in the final energy demand coming down. But generally, for all different end uses, we assume that in the least cost scenario, when a device, an end-use appliance rolled over, when it was reached the end of its useful life, it was replaced by the most efficient new technology possible.
Next question, what is driving the natural gas declines in 2025?
Well, the main thing that's driving natural gas declines in 2025 is the continued deployment of wind and solar, which reduce the need for it in the electricity sector. Electrification of buildings slowly ramps up in the 2020s and then really gets going a little bit further on in the timeline.
Are there plans to also study the ratepayer impact on the model scenario that is incorporated in EMP? I can answer this. The answer is yes. Rutger is doing a study on the ratepayer impact, and that will be incorporated in the final EMP. Next question is it correct to understand that all cost forecasts are incremental? What assumptions are made regarding sunk costs?
So in the case of sunk costs, when we have things that we've invested in already through 2020, those are present in both the reference case and in our decarbonization cases. So the actions that we take are not going to change the recovery of those costs. And typically, as we'll see in the results coming up, we're looking at the net cost difference between our decarbonization cases and our reference cases. And the same sunk costs are present in both, so they net out basically.
Okay. On slide 20, are costs associated with the nuclear subsidy included?
The answer to this is subtle. The model only includes the physical cost, so it doesn't include transfers between different parties in New Jersey. So it doesn't include the nuclear subsidy because those would be a transfer of payments from different parties inside of New Jersey. The model is a quote-unquote physical model, meaning it's saying what should New Jersey spend its money on in order to meet its energy needs and its emissions targets. And so subsidies net out to zero because they come from one actor in New Jersey to another. And we're only looking at total net cost. So no, it does not include those X subsidies as a model input.
Thanks. And just to note that those will be included in the ratepayer impact study. On slide 21, is there a line at the top for coal?
Yeah, you can see there's a tiny line at the black sliver at the top of slide 21 shows the last little bit of coal going away. So I guess that's the answer. Just to be clear also, the model is run at 5-year increments. And so basically by 2025, the coal use is retired from New Jersey.
Okay. How much of the model's emissions reduction are realized through offsets and credits? Does the cost for selling RGGI credits in other states, are the costs for selling RGGI credits in other states included in the least cost pathway?
Yeah, so the way the model handles out-of-state resources is not through RGGI or any other kind of rec market like that. What the model assumes is that New Jersey utilities, say, would invest in out-of-state resources that would not otherwise be built, and then use the energy as it was imported into New Jersey. And the model does take into account like transmission costs and the like, so that New Jersey doesn't rely entirely on its own in-state resources, but is able to invest through a power purchase agreement or some other mechanism to buy out-of-state wind and solar. I'll just note that out-of-state wind connected to PJM, which is shown on the right side of this slide here, does play an important role, both because of the amount, but even more importantly, because it adds a diverse resource from a time perspective, so that it nicely complements both offshore wind and solar inside of New Jersey.
I'll add to that as well to say that when we do have the RPS incorporated in the first 10 years, then we're investing in RECs, but the RECs are priced at the physical cost of building those resources out of state, and we're not trying to forecast what the REC market is going to do over that period of time.
Okay, we'll answer a few more questions here because I think some of the ones that are posted will probably be answered in the next section. But let's go to a couple. Why isn't hydrogen introduced sooner, especially since California has already deployed hydrogen and hydrogen gas stations now with 1 million FCV by 2030?
I mean, the ability to produce hydrogen via electrolysis and use it either in pipeline gas or for other uses is an option in the model. It's not found to be part of the least cost solution for New Jersey. We're New Jersey to try and go beyond its 80 by 50 goals. It's likely that hydrogen would play more of a role. It does play a small role. I'm going to show on this slide here, you can see that the 2050 mix is mostly biogas. This is for electricity generation from gas-fired sources. We mix a small amount of hydrogen into the pipelines, I think up to the maximum amount allowed using the existing infrastructure to generate electricity, but most of it is biogas. It is possible, absolutely, that hydrogen could play a larger role, especially if the technology advances faster than the other things that are competing to play the role of clean firm capacity, and it's going to be needed in the out years towards 2050. And that's especially needed because of New Jersey's 100% clean energy goal, which requires net zero carbon emissions from the electricity cycle. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. I think let's go back to the presentation and we'll circle back with questions after.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Jazz. This is Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research. The next sections, I'm going to introduce our results in a little bit more detail. Chaz introduced the list of different scenarios that we ran. And there's a number of variations there that are basically changing one thing or a couple of things about what our least cost case is defined as, to investigate how different policy actions or different uncertainties might impact our decisions and total costs. So this first section, I'm going to go through what the least cost case looks like. So we have that foundation to then think about the variations. Just before getting into the results, I think it's worth stepping back to the high level and just thinking about the modeling approach again. How did we generate these results? Chaz presented that flow diagram at the start of the presentation. Basically, the first step is that we're building this very detailed model of New Jersey's economy and the energy needs of that economy. It's a bottom-up stock rollover model that represents each of the individual energy using technologies across the economy. And as those technologies age and they burn out, then customers are replacing them with new versions of the same service. And we have assumptions in there about energy efficiency, about fuel switching to electric versions of those kind of services. And that drives our evolution over time of what the fuels required to power our economy look like. So the second step is to aggregate that final energy demand from every sector and that's what's shown on the right-hand side of the chart here. Electricity doubles as we're electrifying a lot of our end uses. Gasoline and pipeline gas decrease pretty significantly as electrification happens. And the other upshot of this is that electrification, or the electricity using versions of these types of services are more efficient. So overall, we have less final energy demand by the time we get out to 2050, even though we have economic growth over that same period. So now that we have that aggregated final energy demand, the next step is to work out how do we serve those needs in the least cost way. So looking at the supply side of how do we produce fuels, how do we allocate biofuels, how do we produce electricity, we work out what the least cost way of meeting this demand is. And I think we can dive into the results now. Next slide, Jess. So looking at our least cost scenario and the installed capacity of in-state resources over time, we get to a fleet size in 2050 of about 3.5 times what we have in 2020. This is driven by the fact that we have that doubling of load over time, but we also get more capacity just because we are switching to renewable resources. They're intermittent, they have lower capacity factors, and so we're building more of them to replace the thermal generation that we have today. The nuclear fleet is extended, so we have licenses coming to their ends in like the late 2030s, early 2040s for the existing nuclear in New Jersey. It's found to be cost effective to extend those licenses, and we allowed that to happen, or we allowed that to be a decision in the model. Firm capacity increases from 12 gigawatts to 17.5 gigawatts by 2050. Firm capacity in 2020 is all of the gas generation in the state. And as we're moving out to 2050, the reason why we're calling this firm capacity is because it's really shifting in its role in the system. Right now, we rely on gas to provide us with energy. But as we get out to 2050, then it becomes a balancing and reliability resource. It's just giving us capacity on the system, and as a result, it's burning very little gas, even though we require more capacity because we have a bigger system. We've doubled our loads, and we have these conditions where renewables may not be producing. In the winter, wind might not be blowing and the sun might not be shining, and we need to be able to replace that energy with something for those transient periods in order to maintain system reliability. In the model, the cheapest thing to do to provide that service is to build out the gas fleet, and by 2050 have it powered by 100% clean biogas to meet that 100% clean electricity standard. As Chaz was pointing out earlier, our technology choice and investment for this particular service can be delayed until after 2030 because we don't start investing in that firm capacity until 2035 and not in significant quantities until 2040. So there's leeway there around what kind of technology could provide this service if research, development, cost projections change over time, then it may be something else by the time we get to 2050. Our offshore wind and energy storage are above current mandates. So offshore wind is 11 gigawatts by 2050 and storage is 9 gigawatts. Next slide. One of the components of our renewable and clean electricity system by the time we get out to these later years is significant quantities of imported resources from out of state. And in our least cost scenario, we're allowing out of state resources to be built out and utilized by New Jersey by importing them across the transmission. We are expanding the transmission from 7 gigawatts to 9 gigawatts to access more of that clean renewable energy. We actually allowed the model to build up to 14 gigawatts on that intertie, but it was more cost effective to add in-state resources than expand that transmission further than 9 gigawatts. Next slide. As Chaz noted, we have this significant reduction in gas supply over time, and this is taking us back to this economy-wide look at energy consumption rather than just the electricity sector. By the time we get out to 2050, we've reduced our gas consumption by about 75%. 1/3 of that gas is biogas, and that biogas is being used to fuel our electricity sector under the 100% clean standard. The remaining natural gas is delivered to the space and water heating loads that we haven't yet electrified and industrial processes that use gas. Next slide. So by the time we're out to 2050, this is what our resource mix looks like. So about 20% comes from out-of-state resources. The majority of that is out-of-state wind. We have 23% from New Jersey offshore wind, 34% from New Jersey solar, 16% from the extended nuclear fleet, and 6% comes from that biogas, which is being used for balancing and capacity services. Next slide. Okay, so the next couple of slides are covering our costs and what are included in our costs, and this will be useful grounding for thinking about the comparison of costs between all of our variations that's coming up in the final section. So costs include demand-side equipment. These are things like vehicles and appliances, supply-side equipment such as wind turbines, power plants, and the fuel and operating costs required for their operations. So the components of costs are first the annualized capital cost of demand and supply-side energy equipment, variable fuel costs in each year in the future, and fixed and variable O&M costs in each year. So this can be thought of as kind of an energy system revenue requirement for people that are familiar with electricity system revenue requirement. It's the annual cost of producing, distributing, and consuming energy in New Jersey. What's not included in these costs are any of the costs outside of the energy system or the benefits from avoiding climate change and air pollution. All costs that you'll see in the presentation are in 2018 dollars, and they're not indicative of rate impacts. A lot of the investments that are being made and are incorporated into these costs are for demand-side equipment, so for electric vehicles, for water heaters, for air conditioners, and for in the reference cases for the fuel that we put into our vehicles. And so it doesn't translate into electricity rate impacts. Next slide. Looking now at what our least cost scenario costs look like, the way that we're presenting our costs are in this sort of net cost paradigm, where we're comparing what we're investing in the decarbonized cases to what we're investing in our reference cases. So how much more expensive is it to decarbonize than to be in a business as usual scenario? The chart on the right-hand side here shows the the cost differences between our reference case and our least cost case. So everything on the positive side of the axis are things that we're investing more in our decarbonized least cost case than we would if we were in the reference case. An example is the orange colored block on the top of the chart there, low carbon generation. This is the additional investment in things like solar, in wind, versus the reference. On the negative side of the axis, these are things that we're actually saving money on in our decarbonized least cost case because we're paying for them in the reference and we don't need them in the least cost case. And the majority of these costs are petroleum products. So not having to buy oil, buy gasoline at the pump. And this is a savings versus the reference case. Taking the difference between the additional costs and the savings gives us what our net cost over and above what the reference case looks like is. And that's shown by the black triangle there. So by the time we get out to 2050, the black diamond, by the time we get to 2050, we're at $2.15 billion per year more than what we would have spent in the reference. Next slide. Okay, so next section here is introducing all of the different alternative scenarios in a little bit more detail, where Chaz gave us the description at the beginning, but I want to show what the impact is of each one of these on the types of decision that we're making in the model. And once we've introduced that, the next section will look at the various different cost comparisons between these cases. So first off, we'll review the reference cases. This first one, business as usual, this is looking at what would happen if we just stuck with the type of system we have today. We're not implementing any of the clean energy policy that's currently on the books going out to 2030. So no offshore wind mandate, no storage mandate, no electric vehicles, etc. Our RPS is constant at 22.5, which is a 2020 RPS going forward. And the major impacts here of business as usual over time is that we see a decline in emissions by about 15%. That's driven by efficiency gains in reference equipment. Just as we push forward in time, we get better, more efficient water heaters, air conditioners, etc. The electricity load increases slightly, but a lot less than in the least cost case. And the gas and nuclear sectors in electricity continue to dominate out to 2050. Next slide. Reference 2 is looking at what happens if we do include all of those policies that are on the books through 2030, and those are listed there on the left-hand side in implementation. The major impacts here is that we do see a larger fall in emissions over time because of these measures that we're taking. It's still pretty significantly higher than the least cost trajectory shown by the dashed line there on the chart. Transportation of buildings emissions plateau after 2030 because we're not pushing forward with more aggressive building measures beyond that. Electricity load increases, still a lot less than the least cost case. And the in-state gas generation is offset by some offshore and imported wind. Next slide. So all of these variations now are variations that meet the targets that New Jersey has set out. So 100% clean electricity and the 80 by 50 target, just like the least cost case. But we're changing something about the least cost case to investigate what an uncertainty about what the future holds for us, how that would impact our costs, or what kind of policy we might put in place, and what the upshot of that policy might look like. So the first one here, regional deep decarbonization, the implementation here is to extend 100% clean and 80 by 50 to the entire Eastern Interconnect. And so now the whole region is decarbonizing. What is the impact on New Jersey? The main impact here is that as the Eastern Interconnect decarbonizes as well, there's an increased demand for renewable generation, and that means increased competition for New Jersey. Because in the least cost case, we were allowing out-of-state renewables to be brought in and count towards our 100% clean and our 80 by 50. Now we're competing for those same resources with other states, so we end up importing higher cost, lower quality renewables and developing additional in-state renewables. But what's not accounted for when we're thinking about costs there is that we have all of these great benefits. This is really what we're after for the entire region to decarbonize so that we can get those CO2 benefits, and that's not accounted for in the costs. This variation is still in process, and so we're not showing the costs, but those costs will be in the final report. Next slide. Variation 2 is looking at what would happen if we had reduced regional cooperation, and so we don't get that ability to build out of state and import into New Jersey. The implementation here is therefore to not allow any new transmission and not allow any out of state resource procurement. The impacts are shown on the right-hand side in terms of number of megawatts of different resources built. One of the main impacts is now we need renewable resources from in-state. So the offshore wind, that middle band, is going from 10.7 gigawatts in our LeastCost case in 2050 to 20.7 gigawatts in variation 2 by 2050. So that's a significant additional cost over the cheaper resources that we were pulling in from other places. We need additional balancing capability and firm capacity for reliability. So there's more energy storage, as shown in the top band, and there's more firm capacity, in this case gas, invested in by the time we get to 2050. We are also burning about double the amount of biogas in electricity because we have less diversity in the renewables in state and more requirement for balancing. Next slide. Variation 3 was to retain gas in buildings. So looking at how New Jersey might meet its goals if it kept gas in buildings and what the cost of that would be. The implementation here was zero electrification of residential and commercial buildings. And one of the main impacts, as shown in the chart here, is that we have an increased final energy demand for the economy, just because when we switch to electric, we have greater efficiencies. We now have more total energy to service by the time we get out to these later years. Higher gas emissions are offset by increased use of biofuels in transportation. And so in those final years, we now have more gas in the economy, which means more emissions. And so to get to our 80 by 50 goal, we now have to take out emissions by substituting biofuels. And that's an expensive measure to take. Next slide. Variation 4 is technology cost reductions. So how would cheaper clean energy affect costs and resource mix? And as Chaz was mentioning in the first half of the presentation, it's often the case that past technology forecasts have been high relative to the actual realized costs when we get to the present day. So we looked at what if we had more optimistic forecasts for renewables and storage and how that would impact decisions in total cost. The impact here, and this is just relative to the types of cost reductions that we included in the model and the scenarios we used, we got more storage built, so 8.7 to 11.6 gigawatts. And we see slightly less firm capacity by the time we get to 2050, just because now our renewables are cheaper, our storage is cheaper, it can displace more of that need for gas and gas capacity. Next slide. Variation 5, nuclear retirement and no new gas power plants. So this is looking at how does minimizing thermal generation affect decarbonization costs. Our implementation here was not to allow any new gas plants and not to extend the nuclear fleet. The major impacts here are that, first of all, we had significantly more offshore wind build. You can see that in the chart. Least costs going from 10.6 gigawatts in 2050 to 26 gigawatts in variation 5 by 2050. That's because we lost all of that energy the nuclear was providing, and we needed to substitute something else for that. The other major impact here is that we've reduced the amount of firm capacity. It's 17.6 gigawatts in least cost, and it's going to 7.4 2050 in variation 5. We now need to build a lot of new storage to make up for that. And so our storage capacity has increased from 8.7 gigawatts to 19.6 gigawatts. But the main story around storage here is that we've had to increase the duration of the storage significantly. So duration has gone from 8 hours to 36 hours. And that's because that firm capacity was providing that service where we had low renewable output for extended time periods, and storage has had to take up that role, which has required significant investment. Next slide. Variation 6 is reduced transportation electrification. This is similar to variation 3 in that we've retained more fuel use in the economy rather than electrify. The implementation here is that we cut light duty vehicle electrification in half. Our medium duty and heavy duty electrification is 0 in this case. And so we've retained this need for fuels, diesel and gasoline, and that's what's shown in this chart here. Least cost case, we are pretty low by the time we get to 2050. We still have significant gas or significant diesel and petroleum requirement in 2050 in variation 6. The impact is that we need to decarbonize some of that now, because if we allowed all of the emissions from that, then we would exceed our 80 by 50 target. And so we've substituted quite a significant portion of that with biofuels. Next slide. Okay, so the next section is getting into the cost comparison, the outcome of all of these differences in build decisions across the variations. Next slide. And what this slide is showing us is that net cost. If you recall the cost chart for our least cost case, where we were showing those black diamonds over time, this is plotting those black diamonds. And so the least cost case, the black line there, is ending in $2.1 billion per year in 2050, just as we showed on that previous chart. And this is now compared to all of the other variations. A trend that we see mirrored across a few of these scenarios is this early relative increase in cost relative to the reference case through 2030, and then it decreases over time after that. And that's just because all of these demand side technologies that we're investing in, such as electric vehicles and electric water heaters, are becoming more cost competitive on a capital basis as they go through 2030 to 2040. And so we see this relative reduction in the net cost in that time period. Variation 3, just walking up the variations of the 2050 line. Variation 3, retained gas in buildings. We see a slight increase in costs in that case from 2030 to 2040. And that's because we're burning gas, and gas is becoming less cost effective versus electricity. But it then drops down in cost in 2040 to 2045, because in the least cost case, we now are starting to build significant amounts of offshore wind to be able to get to our 100% clean 80 by 50 targets. But then going from 2045 to 2050, we see this very significant and steep increase in costs to get to our 80 by 50 target as we start to have to use biofuels to decarbonize that gas supply. And this puts us on a pretty poor footing for achieving any greater decarbonization targets beyond the 80 by 50, because it would require biogas to get us there, and that biogas would increase costs dramatically over our least cost case. Variation 6, reduced transportation electrification. This is showing the same sort of trend as variation 3, but it's higher cost, it's more dramatic because we have more fuel left over in the economy in variation 6. And so we've had to start decarbonizing it earlier. And so we're further along on that pathway of having to get to a decarbonized fuel supply. One thing to note in both these cases is when we exhaust our biofuel capacity, we may have to start producing synthetic fuels if we were to push to say 90 by 50 or 100 at some point, and that would increase costs even further. Variation 2, reduced regional cooperation. Costs are higher all the way along here because we don't have access to those cheaper out-of-state renewables. We are building in-state offshore wind in much greater quantities, and that's driving up our costs. And then variation 5, no new gas and nuclear retirement, or nuclear retires. This case sees extremely dramatic cost increases in those final years. And this is really off the scale here, where we're going to $21 billion. And that's because when we're thinking about options for long-term storage to be able to ride through these reliability conditions, technology at the moment and the price projections for those technologies gets us to a place where it's very much more expensive than to store energy in gas and to burn that gas very transiently. This cost may reduce over time as we see new types of storage technology coming into the market. Next slide. This slide is summarizing a lot of what I just said, and so we don't need to go through it in too much detail. One thing to note though is the final row where we have variation 4, and variation 4 wasn't shown on the previous chart because we can't compare it to our reference case. But in this table, we're comparing it to our least cost case, and it shows by 2050 a reduction in costs of about $1.4 billion a year. And that comes from pretty accelerated cost reductions over the least cost case for our renewables and for storage. Next slide. Putting these costs in context now, looking at the increased costs in our least cost case, and then comparing them to what this means in terms of gross state product. This first table here shows gross state product in 2018, 2030, and 2050 using forecasts of how gross state product and gross domestic product are expected to grow over time. And the percent of GDP by the time we get out to 2050 of our net costs for the least cost case is 0.2%. Going to the next table, when we compare this to our spending in reference 1, and this is what Chaz was showing earlier in the presentation, our total energy spending in reference 1 by the time we get to 2050 is 32.6 billion. In our least cost case is 34.7 billion, and that increase amounts to about 6%. Now on the next slide, if we think about this in a historical context, historically spending on the energy system has been about 5 to 9% in recent history, and this is from 1995 through about 2015. The reason for the volatility that we see in that historical record is because of a number of factors. The recession was in there. Gas prices have been pretty volatile, but the main driver here is oil prices. And the first spike there corresponds to oil prices of about $160 a barrel, the second to about 140. Now comparing that historical spending to what we're seeing for least cost and reference, it's higher. And part of the reason here is that share of spending on energy is projected to decrease. So state GSP is going to continue to increase, and it's less dependent on increased energy use. One example of why this is energy intensity declines with business as usual efficiency. So a notable example of this is light duty vehicle fuel economy. That's expected to continue growing. We still get the same service out of it, but we're using a lot less fuel over time. One thing that we should note though from this graphic is that in both least cost and reference cases, we're using forecasted fuel projections going into the future that are from EIA, and those are not reflecting potential geopolitical or otherwise variations in what our oil prices will do over time. The next slide illustrates an investigation into the types of variation we see here. Next slide, Chaz. If we look at reference 1 versus least cost case in terms of the variance in total cost, and this is in percent of GDP, as we vary the oil price and the gas price, what we see is that in a reference case, business as usual, we're much more exposed to the volatile fossil fuel prices. And so decarbonization acts as a hedge against those fuel price spikes and increases energy security because we have more certainty around where we're going to end up in this high capital cost, low variable cost system. We're not investing in as much fuel. The range here is important to note, where oil prices, we're varying it up by 10%, down by 12%. Gas is 70% up, 30% down, and this is an EIA sensitivity. It's possible that oil prices in particular will vary much more significantly than 10% up, 12% down, because this is not reflecting geopolitical reasons for fluctuating oil prices. And so this gives us a nice layer of protection against those volatile global markets. Next slide. And this is one of the uncertainties in the inputs. Obviously, all of our costs are uncertain, and they're based on forecasts going out into the future that will change over time. But there are inputs that are more significant than others in driving differences in total cost for getting to a decarbonized future. The fossil fuel cost uncertainty is one of those, and that's shown on the left-hand side of the chart here. By the time we get out to 2050, our sensitivity on the LeastCost case, based on that fossil fuel price uncertainty, could even push us into net benefit territory for investment in decarbonization. Another one that is very important in total cost is electric vehicle costs. So the right-hand side chart here shows what would happen if electric vehicle costs were to vary plus 10% or minus 10% on the forecasted costs that we have in the model from NREL. And in this case, it's a very significant swing, and that can push us into net benefit territory as well if electric vehicle costs were to decline faster than is currently forecasted. So that concludes this section of the presentation, and we can open it up again for questions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to go through the questions again. Again, we have a lot of questions. We're going to do our best to get through as many of them as we can. One note that would actually be helpful, if folks could hold off on typing in new questions for a few minutes just to see if your question is already answered, because there are a lot here. Feel free to type it into the box so you don't forget it, but just don't hit send for a few minutes. That'll give us a chance to catch up, and also, like I said, to see if we answer your question. So the first question is on slide 47. Regarding light-duty vehicle fuel economy, CAFE standards were recently put on hold. Given this reality, does this change the slide and model?
Yeah, it would change the result if we were to assume that we had different fuel economy going forward. The projections that we're using are from EIA in their annual energy outlook, and so these are reflective of longer term trends. But it would definitely, if we had lower fuel economy, we'd be burning more fuel, and it would favor decarbonization more than it currently is.
Thank you. In variation 5, can biofuels be used in existing or new gas plants?
Yes, they can be used in both existing and new.
Great.
So it's really just displacing fossil gas in the pipeline going into the plant, and the plant can remain the same technology and use the existing gas fleet that is still around in 2050.
Still on variation 5, does it allow new gas megawatts to be added if there's a corresponding decrease in gas capacity?
Not sure I understand that question, but we definitely, over time, we are retiring gas that is coming to the end of its useful life. And that is naturally decreasing our gas capacity going out to 2050. The additional investments that we're making in gas in the LeastCost case are on top of what's remaining of that gas fleet. So you can see in variation 5 here, we have 7.4 gigawatts. That's what's remaining, that's not yet retired. In the LeastCost case, we have 17 gigawatts. So the difference between those two is how much additional we've built by then.
Great. Is the LeastCost system more vulnerable than today's system? For example, how would one nuclear plant going down be handled?
Well, we enforce reliability constraints in the model, just as today we do in thinking about planning for the grid. And so we need to have enough capacity to handle either unforeseen increases in load or outages of generators. So the capacity that each generator contributes to reliability is derated based on the probability of that generator going out. And so the system would be able to handle those kind of events. It would have enough capacity to ride through an outage of a particular generator.
Hey, Jeremy, I've noticed that there's a number of questions about the approach to reliability. So if you could talk a little bit more about how the model handles reliability, both about the relative value of storage and other generation resources, and just generally how the model ensures that there's enough reliability, especially as heating load requires electricity.
Sure. Yeah, so traditionally we plan for reliability on the electricity system by thinking about peak load conditions. And currently peak load in New Jersey is in the summer. The trouble with using that kind of approach going into the future is that peak load conditions stop defining the reliability need on the system, because it's no longer the load or the magnitude of load that is defining how much capacity we need to build. It's the difference between that load and the amount of renewable generation we have on the system. So there will be periods, particularly in the winter, where there's high loads and there's very little renewable output. And that's when we need to turn on a lot of capacity, and we need a lot of energy to substitute for that energy deficit from the renewables. So what we do is we basically enforce that same kind of peak load capacity constraint that you'd have in traditional planning on every single hour of the year. And so we need to have enough capacity to be able to meet the requirements in every single hour, even when renewables are not producing. We also derate the contribution of each generator towards that peak capacity in each hour. And we do that by the outage rate of the generators. And we also increase the amount of load that we need to serve during those reliability conditions to account for the fact that our forecasted loads may be off. And so what we come out with is a kind of a proxy for a much more detailed, 60 years of weather data kind of loss of load study. But our results compare very favorably to the kind of results that are coming out of loss of load studies when we've done this in other regions.
And Jeremy, another question that I saw that's related to this reliability issue, and actually this variation 5, which is the slide that's up now. Can you just talk about how you handle, the rare weather events that, that are extended, the polar vortex type of situation?
Yeah. So that's another factor I should have mentioned, that in traditional reliability planning, we only think about capacity, but our reliability conditions are increasingly defined by energy need in the future. And that's because we may have long periods of energy deficit where we have renewables producing at very low levels. We have much higher loads, and we need to fill that energy gap with something. What we can do is build a lot of storage, and we can store renewables from a period when they're producing at higher rates, and then discharge into those periods of energy deficit. But that requires a very large storage resource, because that's a lot of energy. And we only use that storage resource on the occasion in the course of the year that those kind kind of conditions happen, which is infrequently. So the cost comparison, when we're thinking about how do we meet that reliability need, is do we build very large quantities of long duration storage, which is high cost based on our current projections, or do we burn small amounts of high cost biogas, but in existing gas generation or new gas generation, which is comparatively cheap, building a new gas plant. And so that's the cost equation when it comes to serving those reliability needs in the future. Biogas is a form of long-term storage. It's just very cheap to store. You can have it sit there for a long time period and then burn it when needed. It's expensive to burn, but the capacity, the capital cost necessary to achieve that service is low cost compared to the equivalent storage investment.
As long as we're on this topic, I just want to add a couple of notes about biogas, and sort of there's some questions around what is that and can it be used in existing plants. The answer is that the biogas that we're considering is in the end just methane CH4, so it's a drop-in replacement for the existing infrastructure, which is say not the case necessarily with hydrogen. The other thing about the biofuels, we're not talking about like corn-based ethanol. We're talking about energy plants grown specifically for this type of purpose, and those of course would not be grown in New Jersey, but would be available. And the cost estimates and the production infrastructure that would go for that would create that supply of biofuels is based on the nice study done by the Department of Energy called the Billion Ton Study, where they talked about the potential for biofuels and included some cost estimates and just how much could be produced, taking conservative assumptions about the kinds of plants that could be grown and where they could be grown, and existing land use concerns as well. So that's where the biofuels would come from. Samantha, I'll give it back to you if you want to find the next question. That'd be great.
Sure, and just because we've had a couple of questions about the availability of the slides, I want to remind folks that the slides will be available on our website and the EMP website after the webinar is complete, as well as the recording. So everything will be available after. Next question refers to the scenario net cost over time. And the question is, through 2044, no new gas and nuclear retires cost less than the least cost scenario. So why not choose that former for now while pushing hard to reduce the spike beginning in 2045, and as we get closer to that time period, revisit? Basically, in other words, defer the nuke extensions and then make a decision as we get closer.
The challenge with that approach is that to electrify the demand side of the economy, it requires on burnout of various different appliances, the replacement of those appliances with electric alternatives. If we don't start doing that electrification process early, then we end up having customers invest in a lot of new gas using infrastructure that by the time we get out to 2045, 2050 is in place and is not going to be retirable and replaceable in a short time period. And so we have this lag from stock rollover and the lifetime of existing infrastructure on the demand side that we need to overcome if we're going to electrify the economy, and that needs to start many years earlier to get all of that infrastructure in place.
Hey, Jeremy, that was a great answer. I think there is a question about that, but that was about variation 3. I think the question was about variation 5, which is the one where there's no firm capacity available. Do you want to sort of provide the same answer about the variation 5?
Oh. Yeah, so the question is, why does variation 5 cost decline there? The answer to that is that, what's that?
Hey guys,
it's sort of the same question. Why can't we follow the variation 5 path and then until later? And variation 5 is the one where we don't invest in new gas and retire the nuclear.
Okay. Yeah, so in that case, we can follow the same path basically through 2035, because there's almost no difference between those scenarios up until then. We don't need to build any new gas until we get to 2035. We don't need to think about retiring nuclear. Well, we probably need to start thinking about retiring nuclear several years earlier than that. But the reason why we have that dip down is because nuclear starts to be less cost effective versus the alternatives in that time period. But nuclear is absolutely necessary for getting to low cost by the time we get up to 2050. And so that blip from 2040 to 2045 is just because we have access to low cost renewables at that point. But by the time we get out to 2050, our 100% clean and 80 by 50 goals are so stringent that the nuclear is a great source of clean energy at that point, and is more cost effective. And so we end up choosing to keep it around to be able to serve our policy goals in that long term.
Okay, so sort of a follow on both of those a little bit. Given the rapid changes in technology and cost, what is your confidence in the 2040 and 2050 data points?
They're going to change a lot over time, basically. When we're getting out to 2040, 2050, we are many years in the future from now, and those forecasts are highly uncertain. The things that we do know from looking out to that time period is the relative cost difference and the relative build decisions between things that are not close in terms of cost, or have structural or operational differences that make them more likely to be put in place than to not. The things that are going to potentially switch are the things that are very close in cost right now in the forecasts, and maybe we end up seeing reductions in one and not the other that would change our decisions in that time period. I think that the thing to keep in mind about doing a plan like this is that we're not prescribing investments for the next 30 years. What we're doing is we're using the best available information right now about how costs evolve over time to be able to inform the best near-term decisions about investments that we can make in the next year, the next 3 years. And as information is updated with better cost forecasts, new technologies potentially coming online, then we can redo this planning cycle, and we can update the types of decisions that we're making in the future.
Did you at all consider scenarios if we come close to our goals but not meeting them? Sometimes the last few % of a goal has very little benefit but substantial cost.
All of our scenarios meet the 100% clean and 80 by 50 goals, so we didn't look at that. One thing to note about this is that typically when we're going to 100% clean, other studies will find that we have rapidly increasing costs to get to that final 100% number. We have less extreme cost increases when we're getting to 100% because we're doing a integrated economy-wide optimization, and that allows us to allocate fuels differently to different sectors. It allows us to mitigate those cost increases in a more realistic way because we have more options and more realistic options on the table for getting to those long-term goals than to look at this just from an electricity-only perspective and try and achieve everything with electricity.
All right, next question. Does the IEP take into account the impacts of sea level rise? And if so, which models assumptions were used to calculate the anticipated sea level rise by 2050?
We did not account for a sea level rise.
Hey, that was a quick and easy one. How have utility energy efficiency programs and state energy efficiency programs been factored into final energy demand in the 7 scenarios and in both reference cases?
So as Chaz described earlier, we have efficiency baked into all of our variations. Basically, we are replacing energy equipment on burnout with the most efficient alternative when it's being replaced. And where we are electrifying, then we're getting also the efficiency gains from switching to the electric version of the same service, of providing the same service.
Couple questions about whether or not we'll be releasing the details and data behind the report.
Our intent already for we've documented the sources for all of the data, which are all public sources. There's no secret numbers on cost assumptions or technology capabilities. They all come from typically government sources or industry standard publications. So the intent is to include all of those sources so that the analysis can be understood by anyone who takes the time to look at those data. But all of the assumptions about, for example, cost of solar or offshore wind or cost of fossil fuels come from industry standard assumptions, and we are going to document those in the final report.
Okay. Have you considered hydrogen production as a possible energy storage technology?
Yeah, so we actually do have some hydrogen being burned in the gas pipelines, which is economic. The model has the option of building hydrogen infrastructure, so building either gas reformation, which is not chosen because it's using gas, but also electrolysis and the infrastructure required to store that hydrogen. It's actually something that if we were pushing to 90 by 50 or a more stringent target than that, we would probably see significant hydrogen production. It would start to become a cost-effective mechanism in decarbonizing the economy. One, because it can be used as a primary fuel source, and two, because it can be turned into other synthetic fuels and used to decarbonize those final energy fuel demands. But New Jersey actually has less industrial activity than some other states that are seeing hydrogen as a least cost option in their plans. And so it's not yet at the point when we go to 80 by 50, New Jersey hasn't reached that point where it starts to become a cost-effective mechanism of decarbonizing the economy. There are things where in the future we might want to investigate the use of hydrogen in transportation, probably not for light-duty vehicles because EVs are a lot more cost-effective in that sector, given current cost projections, but in heavy-duty trucking, for example, it's difficult to electrify that sector, and hydrogen may be an option there. And so that's something that is just developing in terms of what the costs of that look like, what the feasibility of that are, and we might see that as a viable use of hydrogen in the future.
Thank you. Next question is, why is New Jersey capping solar at 7% cost when the benefits far outweigh that cost? And the answer is that it's in the Clean Energy Act. All right, next question. What about the cost of maintaining our current centralized grid through increasing extreme weather versus developing a distributed energy grid?
I don't think that the analysis that we've done is precluding a system that incorporates microgrids. You know, the investment in storage and where that storage is located on the system, we're not making that determination because we don't have the granularity on the distribution system versus the bulk transmission system in this study. But typically storage can be more cost effectively located on distribution portions of the system than at a bulk system level. And that affords the opportunity, given the amount of storage that we're investing in over time, to enable microgrid applications around the state. But in terms of distributed systems versus the grid, I think the grid is playing a very important role in reducing the costs here, because we are getting all of the benefits of those low-cost out-of-state renewables in our least cost case. We're getting the benefits of building offshore wind, and that requires the bulk energy system for delivery of all of that energy. And so it's definitely a necessary component of the least cost cases that we've been looking at.
I want to add a little piece to that too. The distribution system to support the increased amount of electricity use is one of the important assumptions that we have to make, is how much will it cost to reinforce that distribution system to make sure that it can handle the increased load. And so we took quite conservative approach to investments in the grid and the distribution system, but they do play an important role. So it's a conservatism where it's actually you know, we can efficiently improve the grid. The cost of meeting the emissions targets would go down.
Great. How can you discuss costs without including climate and health costs, aka the social cost of carbon?
I guess I can take that. The intent of this analysis is an economics-only analysis. Of course, the social cost of carbon it should be factored in, and that's why when we show the total cost, we compare it to both an estimate of the health benefits and an estimate of the social cost of carbon from EIA. Of course, you know, there's not really a truly agreed upon social cost of carbon, and so we feel it's appropriate to look at the economics only, or the economics without the health benefits, and then compare that to the size of the health benefits. And so that's what we've done here. But there are, of course, other approaches that one could use. But we feel like this is the most conservative approach to take, in the sense that it looks at economics alone, and those benefits would then be gravy, if you will.
Is there a way to model locational emissions reduction, such as environmental justice communities?
So I think that is a very good complementary study to the one that we've done. We are not doing any kind of emissions or fate transport modeling in the work that we've done. We are modeling a very significant reduction in the total amount of emissions from the state and from resources that are currently located in the state, such as gas generation. Where new gas generation is located, we're not making any kind of judgment about that. And that is something that, in further analysis and further study of specific proposals and specific siting considerations would be necessary to get those built in the state. They're not being built until 2035 and after. And so this is a time period in which these kind of challenges can be worked on and incorporated into the plan for New Jersey.
Okay, I think what might be our final question is going back to cost assumptions regarding variable input policy constraints. Does that include only current policies in place or potential future New Jersey or federal policies?
Sorry, was this question about reference 2 and what's included?
I'm not sure. They want to know if the variable input policy constraints includes only current policies in place, or does it include potential future New Jersey or federal policies?
Okay, got it. So looking at the different variations and where those policies come from, in those cases, these are all policies that are not included in current New Jersey policy. They were developed from the feedback that we received from meeting with the stakeholders at the beginning of the project and trying to capture the important issues or the important directions that New Jersey could take going to a decarbonized future. So that's how we designed each one of these variations.
Just to clarify, so going through all of the different scenarios, reference 1 only includes what was sort of business as usual prior to 2018. So it had the 22.5% RPS maintained and solar build out reflective of historical build out. Reference 2 adds the Clean Energy Act of 2018, which incorporated goals such as the 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030, the 2,000 megawatts of storage by 2030, the energy efficiency targets, et cetera. And it also included the multi-state ZEV Memorandum of Understanding, which would commit New Jersey to putting 330,000 EVs on the road by 2025. Beyond that, we then imposed the 80 by 50 Global Warming Response Act emissions reductions onto the least cost and all subsequent variations, as well as the 100% clean energy commitment.
There's another question I wanted to address. It was about variation 5 and sort of what we mean by no new gas capacity. The model assumes a fairly long lifetime for gas plants, but nonetheless, many of them do end up retiring before 2050. So basically, it allows no new gas capacity, no new gas turbines to be built, and so the total gas capacity goes down over time. However, in the remaining gas turbines that are left in 2050, those can be still used using, biogas is what the model projects to be cheapest, but they could be used with synthetic or hydrogen or other gases as well at that time. But again, no new gas capacity could be added, and existing gas plants that reach the end of their life would be retired. I hope that answers that question.
Actually, just a couple more questions before we wrap up. Can you talk through a little bit why biogas is cleaner than methane, or rather is clean?
Sure. So biogas is methane at the end, but it comes from energy crops that would be grown probably not in New Jersey. So the carbon in the end, methane comes, the plants absorb that through photosynthesis, and then they're stored in the plants, and then they, in a production facility, they would be the plants would be converted into various biofuels. And this analysis, is not unique to, the prices and the source for those come from the Department of Energy's billion-ton study, which is publicly available. So that includes both how much of those crops could be made available, taking conservative land use and other assumptions, and at what price. So those fuels, to be clear, are considerably more expensive than on a per energy unit basis than existing fossil-based methane, but they would be carbon neutral, and they are distinguished from the ethanol-based biofuels that are common today, but whose problems are well detailed.
Thank you for that. Then there are two questions that are both related to demand. So I'm just going to read them both, and then hopefully the response can incorporate an answer to both questions. The first is, I'm interested in learning how flexible demand was considered in the models. How were residential, commercial, and industrial demand response considered? For example, is smart electric vehicle charging considered as part of the transportation modeling with shifting charging times? And then the second is, these studies appear to take demand as a fixed assumption. Many states like Pennsylvania have a peak reduction demand response program that dispatches flexible demand for curtailment when grid reaches a demand threshold. Did the modelers conduct a scenario in which peak demand reduction policies are implemented versus not?
So the model does include flexible loads, and it's tied to technologies, and so it's flexible loads around electric vehicle charging, flexible loads around water heating, and these respond in the way described in the second question, where if it's more cost effective to be installing and using flexible load technology, if it's more cost effective to be using that flexible load technology than to be installing some kind of supply side generation source to meet that peak load, then the flexible loads are deployed. Yeah, I think that answers the question.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead and answer those.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question about what are your vehicle technology mixes for the business as usual case and the LeastCost cases? How does an increase in penetration of hydrogen affect these scenarios by decreasing dependence on the grid? This slide, which it will be easiest to see when we make them available, which should be shortly, shows all those kinds of assumptions. And you can see that we assume that basically all in row T1 on the LeastCost column, you can see that we assume that internal combustion engine sales decrease to 0 in 2035, so that basically all light-duty vehicles are electric. And that's in the LeastCost scenario. If we didn't model a case where there was a lot of hydrogen used for vehicles, if we did so, related to the question, it would reduce the dependence on the grid, and so that would be captured by the model because we include the cost of upgrading the distribution system to handle increased load. But as Jeremy mentioned earlier, especially for light-duty vehicles, electric vehicles in their current form and expected cost declines, from the standard sources, really suggest they're a quite efficient way to move people for relatively little energy, or at least compared to today. So they're likely to remain competitive with hydrogen, which would need to be produced from renewable energy sources. So there's a couple of questions about the impact on vehicle miles traveled, such as with increased mass transit and the like. Those would definitely impact the analysis, and we hope to do some extrapolation of the existing results that would take into account reductions in vehicle miles traveled. Of course, that would reduce costs overall. You know, if improved mass transit could be used to move people instead of individual vehicles, then the total energy load required goes down substantially and would certainly reduce costs. There's some questions also about the retaining of nuclear and whether we considered building new nuclear. We did not include the option to build new nuclear fleet, and the cost, you know, we used the best available estimates for the cost to keep the existing and you know, the old nuclear fleet available through 2050, and so those are the costs that we used to get the results that we did. There's a question about whether we did any sensitivity analysis. The sensitivity analysis is really the different scenarios that we ran. Like those sort of consider various end cases. We didn't do sort of a plus or minus type of sensitivity analysis. Given the complexity of what the model does, that would be computationally prohibitive. And as Jeremy did show some sensitivity analysis, for example, on some of the most important variables, which are the cost of vehicles and the cost of fossil fuel prices. It looks like there's a question about demand side. I believe we answered those. Sorry for the delay. There's a lot of questions to go through, and we want to see if we got most of them.
There are actually a couple of questions about the assumption that the nuclear licenses will be extended. Can you address that?
Yeah, we allowed the option of extension in the model, and the extension was accompanied by a cost, which is an EPA estimate of re-upping nuclear basically beyond the current licenses, and the model chose to invest in that cost of re-upping, which is basically a maintenance package to keep it going for the next 20 years. And it chose to extend the entire fleet going out through 2050. There is a question about whether that's possible. And I think that that's something to be addressed going forward. It seems like it's a cost-effective thing to do to keep the nuclear fleet around, and there'll be issues around whether that extension is possible and the other associated challenges to accomplish that.
Great. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to you guys to wrap up, and I just want to remind people that we are opening up a comment period to provide written feedback on the IEP, which will open, now until 5 p.m. on Friday, November 15th. Comments, this is all on our website as well, but comments should be submitted electronically to emp.comments@bpu.nj.gov using the subject line IEP feedback. Chaz and Jeremy, anything else on your end?
Nothing else on my end except just to thank everybody for taking what has been quite a long period of time out of your day to go through this analysis. We hope it was informative, and we look forward to any comments, and we appreciate all the thoughtful questions.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.